So the next talk, we could have had an entire workshop, an entire day on the social issues, the no-brainer social issues. We could have spent a whole day talking about that. We could probably also spend a whole day talking about the wildlife issues and the plant issues that are in these stands over 80. But I chose one species that at this point has an overlay that is most influencing how we're managing our stands and our landscapes. So we asked Betsy Glenn with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to come talk about spotted owls and critical habitat and what happens when you've got an over 80 stand that happens to also be spotted owl habitat. So help me welcome Betsy Glenn.
Hey, thanks, Cheryl. So I'm here today to talk to you about how management of stands over 80 years can influence recovery and conservation efforts for the northern spotted owl. And as most of you know, northern spotted owls are associated with late successional forest conditions. That is, they generally like forests that are over 80 years or older, and they don't do well when there's habitat loss. However, as this workshop has emphasized already today, forests over 80 years vary widely. They're not all the same, and forests over 80 can vary in whether or not they provide good spotted owl habitat. So I'm going to provide an overview of what the threats are to northern spotted owl recovery, the habitat needs of northern spotted owls, including how barred owls influence those habitat needs, and what forest management options in stands over 80 are consistent with spotted owl recovery. So I'll start with a little bit of background. As most of you know, the spotted owl was listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act in 1990. The stated purpose of the ESA is to conserve both the listed species and the ecosystems on which they depend. So for northern spotted owls, this is primarily late successional forest, which provides the nest sites and the prey base that supports spotted owls. And at the time of listing, 1990, the service identified both widespread habitat loss across the species range, as well as inadequate regulatory mechanisms to conserve the spotted owl as the two primary threats. And they also explored a number of other factors such as low and declining populations, limited habitat, inadequate distribution of both habitat and populations, vulnerability to natural disturbances, and predation and competition, including impacts from barred owls at that time. And even in 1990, people had begun to notice that barred owls, which had been considered to be an East Coast native, were becoming increasingly abundant in the Pacific Northwest. And barred owls appeared to be competing with spotted owls for resources, but it was unclear at that time what impact barred owls were really having on spotted owl populations. And at the time of listing, it was anticipated that spotted owl populations would continue to decline for some years after listing, primarily as a result of a lag effect from habitat loss that occurred in the late part of the 20th century. But it was expected that populations would begin to stabilize after a decade or two. So in 2011, the Fish and Wildlife Service issued a final revised recovery plan for the spotted owl. And at that time, the key threats were reassessed. And although both past habitat loss and current habitat loss continued to be threats, it was determined, based on ongoing research and monitoring, that competition from barred owls had become an equally important problem. Northern spotted owl populations showed no signs of stabilizing, and in fact had begun to decline at a more rapid rate, attributed largely to competition with barred owls. In addition, some other factors, such as threats from diseases such as West Nile virus, as well as changes in environmental conditions driven by climate change, were also identified as particular factors. So since the time of listing, habitat loss has continued to be a threat to the species, but barred owls have gone from something that might possibly be a threat to something that's become a major issue over the past 20 years. So a little bit about spotted owl habitat. So decades of research have shown that spotted owls show strong selection for late successional forest conditions. They also have very large home ranges, typically over 1,500 hectares, which is quite large for a raptor species. And they show strong selection for older forest that has complex structure. And this is typically forest over 80 years old, although sometimes this includes forest that is younger than 80 years old. I liked Ray's graph on the first slide this morning that showed that real diversity of old growth stand index across ages. And I think that, particularly in areas where late successional forest is rare, spotted owls do use some of these younger forest types. Spotted owls are also central place foragers. What that means is that they primarily base their activity around where their nest is located. And the habitat closer to the nest plays a stronger role and has a greater impact on their annual survival and reproductive success than habitat that is more distant from the nest site. And finally, you also know that as across the range of the species, the forest composition really varies as to what spotted owls are using. In the northern parts of the range, spotted owls tend to have much larger home ranges. While in the southern parts of the area, they're considerably smaller. Similarly, diet composition varies as well. As you move south, you end up with more wood rats, which are kind of a nice big prey item. Home ranges tend to be smaller in these areas. And also in the more southern areas, small openings within the forest can be beneficial for spotted owls, as wood rats like these types of areas. So population monitoring for spotted owls has been one of the key tools for helping us understand how these threats influence the population trends. And population analyses spanning much of the range of the species have been conducted every 5 years, with the most recent occurring in 2014. And as most of you are well aware, the results of the 2014 analysis are not yet available. So what I'm presenting on this table here are the results from the Forsman et al. 2011 publication, which included data up through 2009. And this table provides a summary of the results for trends for demographic rates from the 11 study areas included in that 2011 publication. And study areas are listed, let's see, was upper right? North to south with Clay, Elm, and Rainier in the north, going down to Hoopa and Green Diamond in Northern California at the bottom. And so the key takeaway message from this table is that annual survival, and this is from up through 2008, was declining at 10 of the 11 areas. And this was of particular concern because the spotted owl is a long-lived species, and for long-lived species, annual survival is the main factor that drives population trends. And when we look specifically at rates of annual population change, there was a clear decline at 7 of the 11 areas. And there were only 4 areas in Southern Oregon and Northern California that did not show a decline during the last analyses 5 years ago. And the annual reports that have come out since 2009 have not shown any improvements in spotted owl population trends since that time, and barred owls have continued to expand their range into these more southern areas as well. These long-term analyses have also shown clear associations between the increases in barred owls and decreases in spotted owl populations, as well as showing some clear associations between higher amounts of old forest and higher spotted owl population performance. So where we are now is that at almost all of these long-term monitoring areas, patterns of spotted owl territory occupancy now look like this. So we have the percentage of spotted owl territories on the y-axis, year on the x-axis. The blue line here shows the percent of spotted owl territories where spotted owls were detected in each year. And the red line shows the percentage of those sites where barred owls were detected in each year. And so none of the long-term study areas in these analyses have yet reached a point where the increases in barred owls nor the decreases in spotted owls have leveled off or reached an equilibrium. So thus we're really kind of faced with a dilemma when it comes to implementing effective recovery strategies for the spotted owl, as both habitat and barred owls have strong influences on these population trends. And in addition, there are habitat conditions appear to influence the effect that barred owls have on spotted owl populations. And so a little bit more on that. What do we know about how barred owls influence spotted owl population rates? So as I mentioned before, barred owls were, until recently, native to the eastern United States. They were first detected in the range of spotted owls probably about 40 years ago, but didn't start to become really abundant until the 1990s. And we'll never really likely know why barred owls moved west, although human-caused changes to the landscapes in the Great Plains may have played a role. And barred owls appear to influence spotted owls primarily through interference competition, which is characterized by aggressive interactions between the two species. Barred owls also have much smaller home ranges than spotted owls and thus can occur in much higher densities in these forested landscapes. Both species appear to have very similar habitat preferences, with both species selecting the oldest forest they can find. However, in areas where both species are present, spotted owls tend to be found on the steeper slopes, while barred owls are more often found in the lower down riparian areas, often with more hardwoods. Both species have very similar diets as well. They prey heavily on arboreal mammals, although barred owls are much more of a generalist and will pretty much eat anything that they can catch. Crayfish, earthworms. If it moves and they can catch it, they will eat it. In his dissertation research on competitive interactions between the two species, Dave Wiens reported that there was higher survival of both spotted owls and barred owls in areas with more older forest. And he was looking primarily at forests older than 120 years. So old forest really seems to be a driving factor for increased survival of both spotted owls and barred owls. And in fact, the availability of old forests and the prey species associated with them appears to be the most strongly limiting factor in the competitive interactions between spotted owls and barred owls. So what does this mean for spotted owl recovery? So the goal of every recovery plan is to improve the status of a species so that it can be removed from the list. And despite the changes in the identified threats for spotted owls between 1990 and the present, the recovery objectives for spotted owls have focused on three main factors. First, having populations that are sufficiently large and well distributed that the species no longer requires listing. Providing adequate habitat so that the species can continue to exist. And finally, that the effects of the threats have been reduced or eliminated such that the populations are stable or increasing. And under the current conditions, implementing such actions to achieve these goals involves a complex interaction of both habitat and barred owl factors. And we really can't separate the two at this point. And so to address the barred owl issue, the service, in partnership with USGS, is currently conducting a barred owl removal experiment to better understand if spotted owl populations benefit from the removal of barred owls, and if such an action is practical and feasible to implement for spotted owl recovery. And preliminary results from other studies done in California do indicate that spotted owl populations increase when barred owls are removed. So this study is currently ongoing at 4 study areas in Oregon, Washington, and California to gain a better understanding of how spotted owls respond across their range to this type of management. And the results of this study will be used to guide future Fish and Wildlife decisions about potential barred owl management. But since today's focus is on forest management, I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about forest management aspects of spotted owl recovery. But it's still important to remember that addressing the barred owl issue is equally important to achieve spotted owl recovery. So in both the 2011 revised recovery plan and the 2012 revised critical habitat rule, the service recognized the need to address both the recovery of the spotted owl and the conservation of the forest ecosystems on which the owl depends. And in developing recovery actions and recommendations, we strove to be consistent with the basic tenets of the Northwest Forest Plan and to provide opportunities for land managers to address multiple land use and management goals in an integrated fashion. So the 2011 revised recovery plan, there are a number of recovery actions that relate specifically to spotted owl habitat and forest management. In particular, recovery actions 10 and 32 pertain to conserving spotted owl habitat. And so recovery action 10 emphasizes the need to conserve spotted owl sites and territories and the habitat associated with them to recover spotted owl populations. And with the continued declining population trends, it's particularly important to conserve those owls that we know are on the landscape. That is the key to maintaining spotted owl populations over time. Recovery Action 32 emphasizes the need to maintain and restore structurally complex, multi-layered forest with large trees throughout the range of the owl. And this relates to a number of other talks that people have given today. And these Recovery Action 32 stands may be outside those spotted owl territories addressed in Recovery Action 10. And many of these Recovery Action 32 stands are also older than 80 years. They tend to be in the more 120-year-old range or higher. And one of the points we did make in the recovery plan was that many of these areas in the wet western forests that are currently functioning as good spotted owl habitat really need little or no active management to continue to function as spotted owl habitat that supports owls. However, there are some stands that are over 80 that are not Recovery Action 10 or 32 and are not currently functioning as spotted owl habitat. And I think in Matt's talk just before this, he had some great pictures that really showed, some older stands that, I was looking at it saying, that's not spotted owl habitat. And I think those are the places to look at when you're considering management actions in areas that are spotted owl critical habitat. And the recovery plan also specifically encourages forest restoration activities in this type of stand, particularly actions that will accelerate the development of these complex late successional forest characteristics within these stands. And finally, just one more plug for from research, which is my background where I came from before this position. Recovery Action 11 encourages that when conducting these types of vegetation management to restore or enhance spotted owl habitat is to design and conduct experiments to better understand how these actions affect owls. And while there has been some research on how timber management activities influence small mammals that comprise spotted owl diets, we still really have very little data on the success of these type of treatments to create spotted owl habitat that spotted owls actually use. So I think that is one area where we still really do need some more information. And so while the recovery plan outlines the actions needed for a species recovery, the critical habitat rule identifies specific geographic areas that contain features essential for the conservation of a threatened or endangered species. And so the final revised critical habitat rule for the spotted owl identified about 9.6 million acres of habitat across 11 geographic regions that we believed to be sufficient to support healthy, stable spotted owl populations. In developing this rule, we also incorporated uncertainty. This is including factors such as barred owls, climate change, and wildfire. Although we did recognize throughout the rule that for the recovery of the spotted owl, we really do need to address barred owls as well as habitat, because addressing one or the other will not lead to the recovery of the species. And so within the designated critical habitat, there are many areas of critical habitat that don't need active management. And these include areas that are currently functioning as good spotted owl habitat. However, within the critical habitat rule, there are some areas that are not currently functioning as habitat or are not on a trajectory to become good spotted owl habitat. And in those areas, we have encouraged management actions that maintain and restore ecological function where it's appropriate to do so. And this includes addressing factors such as disease, fire, insects, restoring ecological processes that have been disrupted by human activity, as well as restoring ecological processes that are being disrupted by climate change. And throughout both the critical habitat rule and recovery plan, we have explicitly stated that where actions promote restoration at the appropriate scales, this is completely consistent with spotted owl recovery. And so within the rule itself, the service provides recommendations for forest management within critical habitat. And our primary goals include encouraging actions that do not turn habitat into non-habitat. In addition, actions that maintain, if you're conducting activities in an area where there are spotted owls, that these actions maintain site occupancy and reproductive success at these sites. And also that these actions restore ecological function. And I was happy to see that I think one of the presentations just before mine had a very similar slide with a very similar bullet. So it's great to see that we're on the same page with that. It's also important to note that not all critical habitat is occupied by spotted owls. So in looking at where management can be implemented on the landscape, to look at where owls are distributed on the landscape and where those most productive sites are, and emphasize protection and conservation of those sites. In addition, not all critical habitat that is over 80 years old is necessarily high quality spotted owl habitat. Critical habitat is not a reserve. If you recall the slide defining what critical habitat is, it does include that special management actions may be needed to conserve that type of habitat. And in fact, there are some areas that need active management to maintain spotted owl habitat. This includes those stands that are not on a trajectory to become spotted owl habitat. And that throughout both the recovery plan and critical habitat rule, we have encouraged using a restoration forestry or ecological forestry approach. And that's looking at what the ecosystem function is, as well as natural disturbance and what types of ecosystem functions may have been disrupted, and gear management activities to restore these processes. So within the critical habitat rule itself, there are a number of special management considerations that were addressed when considering forest management actions in these areas. And one of the emphases was to focus vegetation management outside those occupied spotted owl sites and high-value habitat. And this relates also back to Recovery Action 10 and 32 in the recovery plan. We also look at focusing on restoration on adapting to climate change and restoring habitats that have been altered by past management. This includes, while this is a west side focused workshop within the critical habitat rule, we also considered differences between spotted owl habitat on the east side versus west side of the Cascades. And also we emphasize designing and implementing restoration treatments at the landscape scale, which involves coordinated and cooperative approaches among land management managers to develop strategic efforts that both conserve spotted owls and restore ecological functions at a landscape scale. And in particular, looking at retaining and restoring the key structural components that are important for spotted owl habitat, as well as the heterogeneity within among forest stands that characterizes high-quality spotted owl habitat. And so just a quick summary of how efforts for conserving spotted owls relate to managing stands over 80 years. For stands over 80 years with structure that supports spotted owls, that's generally good spotted owl habitat. And most of these areas on the west side don't need a lot of management. And in particular, maintaining this high quality older forest is essential for spotted owls when barred owls are present, because as resources become more limited with the two species competing for these resources, it does appear that having more old forest, which is generally slightly over 80 years, kind of more in that 120-year range, appears to have a strong influence on the ability of spotted owls to persist on these landscapes. It's also important to realize that there are areas that may be over 80 years that generally lack the structural conditions to support spotted owls. And these are the areas that we think management activities should be focused on, looking at restoring ecosystem function and getting these stands on a trajectory to provide spotted owl habitat into the future. In addition, in both the recovery plan and critical habitat rule, we realize that restoration activities are also needed in stands less than 80 years old. And I think Stephanie highlighted some of these needs and activities that have been going on in younger stands as well. And then conserving these spotted owl sites that we have on the landscape is critical right now. We still don't know how the spotted owl, barred owl competition is going to play out over the next several decades. And I think we're in a real interesting position right now. We're just starting in with our research to see how feasible managing barred owls will be. But I think at this point, maintaining spotted owls on the landscape is key if we hope to see them persist into the future. And I see Cheryl's waving me down, so I'll stop talking now.